They didn't just cut down my orchard. They erased 40 years of my family's life in a single afternoon. And the part that still gets me is how confident they were while doing it. They honestly believed nobody would question it. Nobody would push back. And by the time anyone noticed, their shiny new development would already be making money. What they didn't realize was that my father spent most of his life preparing me for people exactly like them. My name is Ethan Mercer, and this happened just outside a small town in western Tennessee, where my family had been growing peaches, pears, and apples for longer than I've been alive. My grandfather planted the first trees in the late 70s. My father expanded the orchard through the 80s and 90s. By the time it became mine, it wasn't just a piece of land. It was the place every memory seemed connected to. I still remember the day everything started. I was coming back from visiting an old friend about an hour away. Nothing unusual. Just another warm afternoon. Radio playing low, windows cracked open. Then, about half a mile from my property, I noticed something strange. The smell. At first I couldn't place it. Sweet. Heavy. Almost alcoholic. Like fruit left in the sun too long. I remember thinking maybe a shipment had spoiled somewhere nearby. But as I got closer, that feeling in my stomach started growing. You know that feeling when your brain notices something before your conscious mind catches up? Like some part of you already knows bad news is waiting around the corner. By the time I turned onto the gravel road leading to the orchard, my hands were gripping the steering wheel tighter than they should have been. Then I saw it. I hit the brakes so hard the truck skidded. For a second, I honestly thought I was looking at the wrong property. The trees were gone. Not trimmed. Not harvested. Gone. Hundreds of mature fruit trees reduced to splintered stumps sticking out of the ground like broken bones. Ripe peaches were crushed into the dirt. Pears lay smashed beneath heavy equipment tracks. Sections of irrigation pipe hung from the soil like exposed veins. I just sat there, engine running, door open, unable to move. You hear stories about people freezing during traumatic moments, and honestly, I never understood it until then. Because your brain keeps trying to reject what your eyes are showing you. This couldn't be my orchard. This couldn't be the same place where my grandfather taught me how to graft branches. This couldn't be where my dad used to wake me up before sunrise every harvest season. But it was, and somebody had destroyed it. Eventually I got out and started walking. Not because I knew what to do, just because standing still somehow felt worse. Every step brought another memory. That corner where Dad built my first treehouse. That row where Mom used to take family photos every fall. The old irrigation ditch I'd fallen into at least 20 times as a kid. Everything looked wrong. Like someone had taken a photograph of my life and started erasing pieces with a giant rubber eraser. Then I heard a voice behind me. "Sir." I turned around. A man in a white button-down shirt was walking toward me, carrying a clipboard. Mid-30s maybe. Clean shoes. Expensive watch. The kind of guy who looked uncomfortable standing on actual dirt. "You the property owner?" he asked. I stared at him. "Depends what happened here." He glanced around casually. "Site clearance." Site clearance. Like he was talking about weeds. Like this was normal. I laughed once. Not because it was funny. Because it was either laugh or lose my temper. Site clearance. I repeated. "Correct," he said. "Preparation for the Meadow Ridge Commercial Center frontage expansion." Then he pointed across the highway. That's when I noticed the construction. Steel beams, glass panels, massive cranes, an enormous retail complex rising where empty farmland used to be. The project everyone in town had been talking about for years. I looked back at him. "You cut down my orchard." He checked his clipboard. The vegetation fell within redevelopment parameters. Vegetation. I swear, people can make anything sound harmless if they use the right word. Those were fruit trees. Non-protected agricultural elements. I remember staring at him for several seconds. Then I asked the simplest question possible. Did anybody think about calling me first? For the first time, he hesitated. Just slightly. Then he said, "Notification was deemed unnecessary." Deemed unnecessary. I'll never forget those words. Because standing there, looking at 40 years of family history scattered across the dirt, I realized something. These people didn't see land the way we did. To them, it wasn't memory. It wasn't legacy. It wasn't family. It was just space. A blank area on a map waiting to become something more profitable. The man eventually walked away, probably assuming the conversation was over. But I stayed there until sunset, and as the light faded across the ruined orchard, another memory started pushing its way to the surface. Something my father used to talk about whenever local developers came sniffing around farmland. Permits, environmental reviews, compliance agreements. Back then, I never paid much attention. But standing there among the stumps, one specific phrase suddenly came back to me. Green buffer zone. I didn't know why I remembered it. Not yet. But something about those 3 words refused to leave my mind. And before the night was over, I was going to find out exactly why. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw tree stumps. Not trees. Not orchards. Not memories. Just stumps. The strange thing was, after the anger started fading, something else took its place. Curiosity. The kind that keeps poking at the back of your brain until you finally give in. Around midnight, I got out of bed and walked to the old storage shed behind the house. The shed had belonged to my father before he passed away. Most people would have called it clutter. Dad called it preparation. He kept everything. Tax records, property maps, permit applications, letters from county offices nobody else would have bothered saving. As a kid, I used to joke that if civilization collapsed, Dad would still be able to find a receipt from 1987 in under 5 minutes. Back then, he would laugh and tell me the same thing every time. Paper beats power, son. People forget that. I never understood what he meant. Until that night. The shed smelled like old wood and dust. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, flickering every few seconds like it was debating whether to retire. I spent nearly 2 hours digging through boxes. Old photographs, insurance paperwork, equipment manuals. Then finally I found it. A thick folder labeled County Development Review, Meadow Ridge Project. I froze. I honestly hadn't expected to find anything. But there it was. The original planning documents from years earlier. I carried the folder back into the house, spread everything across the kitchen table, poured myself a cup of coffee, and started reading. 1 hour later, I found exactly what my memory had been trying to tell me. Green buffer preservation requirement. I read the paragraph 3 times, then a 4th, then a 5th. My pulse started climbing. The development approval wasn't unconditional. It never had been. The county had approved Meadow Ridge under several environmental conditions. One of those conditions required the preservation of a designated agricultural buffer between the commercial complex and surrounding rural properties. That buffer wasn't theoretical. It wasn't optional landscaping. It wasn't decorative. The attached map showed exact acreage. Exact gundarias. Exact measurements. And sitting right in the middle of that designated zone was my orchard. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. Then I started laughing. Not because anything was funny, because suddenly everything made sense. Those idiots hadn't just destroyed my orchard. They had destroyed part of the legal foundation supporting their own project. For the first time since the bulldozers arrived, I felt something better than anger. I felt direction. The next morning, I organized everything into a binder. Photos of the damage, property records, planning documents, maps, permit conditions, every piece of evidence I could find. Then I drove into town. The county planning office sat inside one of those government buildings that somehow looked exactly the same in every state. Beige walls, fluorescent lights, furniture that seemed older than most of the employees. A young woman sat behind the front desk. She gave me the standard customer service smile. "Can I help you?" "I hope so," I said, because I think somebody made a very expensive mistake. That got her attention. Not much, just enough. I placed the binder on the counter and started explaining. Slowly, carefully. No jilling, no speeches, no dramatics. Just facts. I showed her the orchard photographs, the demolition, the planning documents, the buffer zone language, the compliance maps. At first she looked bored. Then she looked curious. Then she looked concerned. By the time she reached the highlighted section of the approval agreement, her expression had completely changed. "Would you mind waiting here?" she asked. Not at all. She disappeared through a side door. 10 minutes passed, then 15, then 20. When she returned, she wasn't alone. An older man came with her. and another woman carrying a stack of files. The older man introduced himself as Deputy Planning Director Mark Ellis. He sat across from me and reviewed the documents himself. The room became very quiet. Nobody was smiling anymore. Finally, he closed the file. "Mr. Mercer," he said carefully, "where exactly were these trees located?" I pointed at the map. His jaw tightened. That was the moment I knew. They hadn't realized it either. The county had approved the project years ago. Staff had changed. Administrations had changed. People moved on. But paperwork doesn't. Paper waits. And paper remembers. Within 3 days, inspectors were on site. Actual inspectors. Not consultants hired by developers. Not public relations people. Government inspectors carrying measuring wheels, tablets, survey equipment, and enough forms to kill a forest all by themselves. I spent most of that week watching from a distance. They measured everything, photographed everything, compared original site plans against current conditions. Every day, more vehicles arrived. Every day, more conversations happened. And every day, the atmosphere across the highway became noticeably different. The construction crews could feel it. You could see it. People started gathering in groups instead of working. Supervisors spent more time on phones. Meetings seemed to happen every hour. Then came Friday. Around noon, a county vehicle pulled onto the construction site. 2 officials stepped out carrying folders. 1 hour later, half the machinery shut down. By evening, almost everything had stopped. The following Monday, the official suspension order was issued. Temporary construction freeze, pending environmental compliance review. The wording sounded boring. The consequences weren't. Because here's something most people don't realize. Large developments survive on momentum. Investors need confidence. Tenants need certainty. Lenders need predictable timelines. The second uncertainty enters the picture, everybody starts asking questions. And questions are expensive. Within days, rumors spread through town. Somebody heard permits had been flagged. Somebody else heard environmental violations were involved. Another person claimed the project might be canceled entirely. Nobody knew the full story, but everybody knew something had happened. I started hearing conversations everywhere. The diner, the gas station, the hardware store. One afternoon, I stopped for coffee and overheard 2 contractors talking. Whole project's bleeding money right now. Over what? No clue. I quietly sipped my coffee and kept my mouth shut. A week later, things got worse for Meadow Ridge. One of the major retail tenants delayed signing its lease agreement. Another requested clarification about compliance concerns. Local newspapers started asking questions. County officials started asking more questions. Investors started asking the questions everyone fears most. How bad is this? And how much is it going to cost? One evening, I drove past the site just before sunset. The place looked completely different. The massive steel structures were still standing. The glass storefronts were still there. The giant promotional banners still hung from the buildings. But without movement, without confidence, without momentum, it felt empty. Like a movie set after the actors go home. Workers stood around talking. Equipment sat idle. Security guards paced back and forth near unfinished entrances. For the first time since my orchard had been destroyed, the people responsible were experiencing uncertainty too. Now, I'll be honest with you. Part of me enjoyed seeing that. Maybe I shouldn't have. Maybe that's not the noble answer. But after spending weeks staring at the wreckage of something my family spent decades building, it felt good knowing consequences were finally landing somewhere besides my doorstep. Then about 2 weeks after the suspension order, a black SUV pulled into my driveway. I watched it through the kitchen window. The vehicle alone told me whoever was inside wasn't there for a casual conversation. The driver's door opened. A tall man stepped out. Gray suit, polished shoes, expensive watch, controlled expression. The kind of person who usually has other people solve problems for him. I didn't recognize him, but I knew exactly who he worked for. A few moments later, he knocked on my front door. When I opened it, he extended his hand. "Mr. Mercer, my name is Nathan Calloway." I shook it. His grip was firm, professional, calculated. "I'm the executive director for Meadow Ridge Development." There it was. The real conversation had finally arrived. And judging by the tension hiding behind his smile, I had a feeling it wasn't going to go the way he expected. I stepped aside and invited Nathan in. He thanked me politely, the way people do when they're trying very hard not to reveal how nervous they actually are. I led him into the kitchen, and of all places, we ended up sitting at the same table where my father used to sort paperwork late into the night. For a moment, I almost smiled at the irony. If Dad could have seen that scene, he probably would have enjoyed it more than I did. Nathan placed a leather folder on the table and folded his hands. "We'd like to resolve this situation," he said. "Straight to business. No small talk. No pretending." I respected that. "Good," I replied. "So would I." He nodded. "After reviewing the circumstances, we've determined mistakes were made during the site preparation phase." Mistakes. Interesting word. A mistake is forgetting milk at the grocery store. Bulldozing hundreds of mature fruit trees tends to feel a little bigger than that. Still, I let him continue. "We're prepared to fund replanting efforts, upgrade irrigation systems, provide financial compensation, and assist with restoration." There it was. The offer. Neatly packaged. Professionally delivered. The kind of solution executives like because it allows everyone to move on. Nathan slid a document across the table. I glanced at it. The number was substantial. More money than my father ever made in a single year. More money than most people in town would ever see sitting in front of them. Nathan watched my reaction carefully, probably expecting hesitation, maybe even gratitude. Instead, I slid the paper back. His eyebrows moved slightly. "Not much. Just enough." "I'm not interested," I said. For the first time, the polished executive mask cracked. "Mr. Mercer?" "No." He leaned back, studying me, trying to figure out whether I was bluffing. I wasn't. The truth was, after everything that had happened, the money wasn't the important part anymore. A month earlier, I might have accepted it. A month earlier, I might have been angry enough to settle. But now I understood something bigger. I looked at him and said, "You didn't destroy trees. You destroyed the condition that keeps your project compliant." The room went quiet. Nathan didn't interrupt, which told me he already knew I was right. "The orchard wasn't just sitting next to your development," I continued. "The orchard was helping justify your development." His jaw tightened, just a little. Again, that told me everything. I opened the county map and placed it between us. "You built your approvals around this buffer zone. You used it to satisfy environmental requirements. You used it to satisfy visual impact requirements. You used it to satisfy community concerns." Nathan looked down at the map, then back at me. "What exactly are you asking for?" Now we were finally having the real conversation. I took a breath. Then I laid out my terms. Not because I wanted revenge, because I wanted accountability. First, I said, full ecological restoration. He nodded slowly. Second, native species only. No dequerotibre replacements. No shortcuts. Another nod. Third, soil rehabilitation and long-term maintenance. His expression became more serious. I kept going. Fourth, independent environmental oversight for the restoration process. That one clearly hurt. Nobody likes being monitored, especially after getting caught. Then I gave him the final condition, the one I knew would matter most. As long as your development benefits from the environmental value and visual protection provided by this land, there will be ongoing frontage compensation. Nathan stared at me. For several seconds, he said absolutely nothing. Outside, I could hear wind moving through the remaining trees near the backfield. Inside, the silence felt heavy. Finally, he spoke. "That creates a precedent." I shrugged. "So, does bulldozing somebody's livelihood without permission?" That answer landed exactly where I wanted it to. Because the truth was simple. Everybody in that project had been thinking about costs. Nobody had been thinking about value. There's a difference. Cost is what you pay. Value is what you depend on. And they depended on that land, whether they wanted to admit it or not. Nathan leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. I could almost see the calculations happening behind his eyes. Lawyers, investors, delays, public relations, construction schedules, lost revenue. Every path probably led to the same conclusion. Fighting me would cost more than working with me. Eventually he nodded. A single nod. Small. Controlled. Defeated. "We can agree to those terms." Just like that. No dramatic argument. No shouting. No threats. because sometimes the biggest victories happen quietly. We shook hands. Then Nathan gathered his folder and stood. Before leaving, he paused near the doorway. You know, he said, most people would have taken the money. I looked at him. Maybe. He smiled slightly. Then he left. And for a long time after the SUV disappeared down the driveway, I sat there alone, not celebrating, not feeling victorious, just thinking, because the orchard was still gone. My grandfather's trees were still gone. The memories attached to those exact branches, those exact rows, those exact seasons, those are gone too. Nothing was bringing them back. What happened next wasn't a victory. It was a correction. And maybe that's the most realistic form of justice most of us ever get. Over the following months, the restoration began. This time the equipment arrived carefully. No rusing, no destruction, soil specialists, environmental consultants, agricultural crews, people who actually understood the land. New trees were planted, not tiny saplings. Mature stock with healthy root systems. New irrigation lines were installed. Damaged soil was restored. The work took time, the way meaningful things usually do. One morning I was walking the property when a crew member looked up from a planting trench and said, "We're making sure it's done right this time." I nodded. Good, because for the first time in a long while I believed it. Across the highway, Meadow Ridge eventually reopened. Construction resumed. Stores opened. Customers arrived. Life moved forward. Most people driving through town today would never know what happened there. They see the shopping center. They see the parking lots. They see the businesses. What they don't see is the line of restored trees standing quietly beside it. What they don't realize is that one exists partly because of the other. And maybe that's the lesson. Sometimes the things people call obstacles are actually the things holding everything together. Now here's where I'd love to hear your opinion. Some people in town still think I went too far. They believe I should have accepted the money and moved on. Others think I didn't go far enough. They think I should have pushed until the entire development collapsed. Honestly, I understand both arguments, because the line between justice and revenge isn't always as clear as people pretend it is. So if you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you have taken the original settlement and walked away? Would you have fought even harder? Or would you have handled the situation completely differently? Let me know down in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about property rights, community conflicts, unexpected consequences, and ordinary people standing up against powerful interests, make sure you subscribe and stick around. Because trust me, this wasn't the last time someone looked at a piece of land and assumed it was worth less than it really was.